Hello everyone, today we talk about the foreign policy of Pope Benedict XIV. Schwerpunkt will cover all the papal pontificates in history in thorough detail. We're just at the very beginning of this. We already made a couple of videos about single pontificates, but it's obvious that this is enshrined like in the whole history of the urbs, that they have a series about the eternal city just in the history of Rome per se, as the destination that all roads lead to. Not only this, but of course there is much about Papal State history that in a sense today we will look, if anything, because of the international stand that would bring the same polity to become a battlefield during the War of Austrian Succession. In fact, we never talked too much about the 18th century, everything from this time onwards we have somehow not dealt with the same level of thorough detail, at least so far. Like, of course, as I was just saying, our plan is to cover everything, like politically, militarily, and socially, the entire history. If anything, of the West, but of course of the world. There is a matter of hierarchy there, of importance there, but we take our times. I could simply make digressions on why it's important to study papal history, why the average person doesn't even know what it means, because they literally have never learned any of it, but they, on top of that, they have been prevented mostly from doing so, or at least they have substantially indoctrinated to demonize Catholicism, the papacy. That there is a whole branch of the same Western world that sort of decayed, mostly following that track. And the point is not much the primigenial meaning of Rome that we will of course illustrate in many other videos, especially this year that coincides with the Jubilee. But it's also and simply a matter of recognizing the importance of states that were expressly removed from your education and that you can't sort of simply deny, nor in the objective lack of this information, but especially in sort of the disproportion that has been generated by this mechanism, meaning if you do not know European history, also to the level of, for example, the Papal States, the question is, what can you exactly understand about the world picture? Like, I've been on YouTube for a long time, and I've seen really lots of videos being made about so many different topics, mostly and as dramatically shifted towards contemporary history for all the possible reasons. But when you look at it from a sort of more detached point of view, and overall, after years, you realize there are certain topics that are just never being covered. And it's not like they are the less important, as a matter of fact. There is just a very specific narrative, referentialism, and general distortion of historical plenitude, so to say, that at some point people follow without even knowing the reason why anymore. Right? Let's leave aside strictly political, ideological beliefs to prefer different topics. Just there were very specific ideologies that left a mark, to the point that people are not even aware of these ideologies having been there, in spite of the fact that they're still following in the wake of them, in order to deliberately ignore other topics, other ideologies for that matter. And this is literally the worst side of the story, having lost even the notion that these things were relevant and why. Right? It's like the example of, I don't know, there was a generation of Marxists that sort of got into the two world wars, and then, especially in the West, to a degree, or at least a cultural one, took over certain branches of education that had a very specifically, it was a reaction, of course, to the defeat also of fascism, of National Socialism, but also there was this actively sort of project, actively planned projectuality to indoctrinate people in that those specific ideologies, successors, let's say we can say the children, the grandchildren of these people that already lacked in general at that point in history that idea of tradition and the sacred, also for, even more for ideological reasons, diluted ever more that awareness against which originally maybe their fathers or grandfathers were beginning to resume this in fact traditional, also anti-ecclesiastical ideas, to completely lack even the reason why they are, for example, from a certain side of the aisle, right? The average sort of liberal professor nowadays does not really even think that he's there in order to make specifically, I don't know, Marxistic propaganda, or sort of leaning or interpreting history leaning mostly from the side of the aisle. They may realize that, but they have completely lost the notion of why originally they were doing so, or even if they do so, they have lost the mission accomplished for the guys coming before, in part, the notion of what were the targets of this ideology, because this ideology successfully worked to make people, including their sort of successors, forget that they existed. It's not like you can't, of course, know about Pope Benedict XIV. It's just that the entire notion that this was such an important chapter, for example, in European history, ecclesiologically and politically and more, has been sort of put aside. You've been put along this track, the mold of which simply you have not been brought to question, and it would just take just to even know who this guy was, just to be interested in him. Naturally, these videos of mine, that I don't specialize in the history of the church per se, making lots of videos that are considered, in fact, because of all this premise, by people, I don't know, some sort of niche topic. Except they aren't, and also what I'm doing is very introductive. It's not like I make only introductions, right? On Schwerpunkt, we arrive to the point in which we get relatively thoroughly in-depth things, but people do not even recognize that anymore. It's as if they thought this, if I say it's an introduction, they will say he makes just introductions, but maybe they don't listen to, say, the level of depth these introductions actually are, compared, in fact, easily to the lack of any depth, or even the absence of any video about this topic out there. When those who actually listen to it, they convince themselves that, since again they literally never even heard that this existed, that this is so much niche and it's such a minor thing, and they sort of remain boxed within the confines of their own ignorance, which is literally the worst thing you can do to yourself in a strictly intellectual sense. Except, of course, not knowing these topics will also annihilate your moral, other than just in fact a scientific dimension. As you can see from the title and as a premise, this video is not going to be even about the entire pontificate of Pope Lambertini, Benedict XIV, Prospero Lambertini. It was Prospero Lorenzo Lambertini, who was born in Bologna on March 31st, 1675, and died Pope in Rome on May the 3rd, 1758. This is mostly about the international policy of Benedict, in fact, for the Papal States in the very peculiar European situation of the time. This is a very interesting moment in Europe, as we often make the case that, especially up to, say, before the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, that here was sort of yet to come, but this is the point. Things that were accelerating. There was, in fact, indeed, a more traditional and spiritual world than before, and things brusquely accelerated in the last couple hundred years from our own. But we tend to forget, in fact, how close, how near, and how still existent, actually, in the case of the Vatican State, for that matter, the Catholic Church, such polities, actors, and institutions are to us also within those contexts. Indeed, if you study just the 18th century for saying, I don't know, this is just the century of enlightenment in the strictly secularistic and modernistic sense, which was not even true. In fact, Benedict XIV, believe it or not, was actually an expression of Catholic enlightenment on the basis of Muratori, that if you don't know who he was, well, for the followers of a medieval history channel, you should pose yourself a question or two. You see, how often do you even hear this name around, and how undeniably central this was to the actual foundation of modern medieval historiography, to the point that you don't know anything about this guy. In fact, the very context in which he was operating, and the fact that he was a prelate, all right, and that he literally predated all the other major national endeavors and, say, philological reconstruction, like fixation of particular scientific standards in the medieval sources, publishing, etc. Well, this could influence even, say, from a cultural point of view, a pope. In an era like this, Benedict is actually famous for the fact that he, as a member of the enlightened, so to say, establishment of Europe, sought a dialogue with the broader movement that at large, as you know, did have more sort of modern and secular ideas, intents, than the Papal States would have accepted. In fact, later in his pontificate, Benedict, in spite, as we will see now, of his innovations and sort of openings, like sort of came back a bit to a more conservative approach to these ideas, and also blaming, of course, the most extremistic ones of the time, which were openly anti-clerical and anti-Christian, in some, at least in the most extremistic fashion. Today, most people think that the Enlightenment was fundamentally just a great push away of religion, or was an atheistic. It actually wasn't. But again, we have just so much time for dealing with every topic in depth at a time. We will surely make another video, I don't know when, because this stuff comes from the cycle and it takes a while, of course, before it repeats itself. But I would like to start, before looking at the international policy, the foreign policy of the papacy here, to some aspects of Benedict XIV's activity. He was Bishop of Rome and Pope of the Holy Catholic Apostolic, in fact, Roman Church from August the 17th, 1740, day of the election of the 255th scrutiny, to his death, that, as we've seen, occurred in 1758. Very interesting years, right? It's incredible how, regardless of the vastity, again, of the topics that here I'm lamenting, being impossible to be covered so frequently, chronologically close videos come to be so intertwined. Like just the other day, I was making a video about the French and Indian War and the beginning of the 7 Years' War. Here we are basically on the doorstep of the latter. Actually, the French and Indian War has already began. Now, this is useful concerning what I was talking about before, the fact that while there are, issues that you may think to be so central, like, I don't know, the British and French confrontation in North America, you realize that there are other things, and in perspective, I don't know, the siege of Fort Duquesne or Fort Necessity are just literally some hundreds of men fighting. Who does know about the Austrians and the Spanish fighting, in fact, even around Rome during these years, during the War of Austrian Succession? Of course, it's normal that, mostly deservedly, also considering the late, especially the overall accomplishments, Anglo-American biased global culture, we do not know so much about the War of Austrian Succession at a popular level like the 7 Years' War proportionally. Not that, of course, the 7 Years' War did not have an impact. In fact, in this matters as well, but just in a broader sense, right? Just check, this is what I always invite you to do, like run a simple background check on YouTube of how many videos have been done on this or that topic, and just simply realize that that's today, in today's world and through the internet, the measure of how much people get interested in a given topic compared to another. All right, that's an issue, right? It is an issue. It's not a matter of that there is always going to be a certain bias also connected with where you come from, which to a degree is perfectly fine. The problem is when you sever out a part of it, just by knowing, by the way, that that thing exists, but wishing, in a sense, for what you know at a given moment to be just enough per se, because it's basically what you've been brought up with, also without even necessarily knowing too much about it. But again, few things about Pope Lambertini. First of all, the guy was, we've seen it, he was from Bologna, and his family was founded, just anecdotally, but still for a medieval history, medieval warfare based channel, like it was founded by the leader of the Bolognese Crusaders to Jerusalem in 1095 during the First Crusade. So just for telling also the history of this house, of course this was a very old, ultra noble Bolognese house. We'll talk about medieval Bologna also at some point. The guy was elected pope. We will partly see this now because he was fundamentally neutral between the French and the Austrians. This happened before these would, as you know, ally with one another, especially for the 7 Years' War. In fact, making the Pope quite happy, as we will see. Deep issues behind, of course, the papal elections were these specific factions behind. Even more anecdotal stuff, you may think it's useless to know. This Pope was the first one to create an official touristic guide of Rome, right? Literally issued, like, touristic guides of Rome has existed since ever, like since the first Jubilee, since ever you can remember. But this was sort of the official one of the papacy at the time. The guy was considered to be a very, open-minded individual, even a liberal one for the time standards. For example, he pushed for the second woman doctor in history, Laura Bassi, to teach at the University of Bologna. He was the first one, this was very important from an international point of view, to recognize, at that point, the Prussian sovereign, this case was already Frederick II, Frederick the Great, not as Margrave of Brandenburg, but as properly sovereign of Prussia, officially so. And consider that, of course, this was a Protestant power, so there were enormous issues with this, like the dialogue with the Enlightenment here embraced some sort of, indeed, also in this case, more modern secular approach to international politics, and the ones you could have really a dialogue with and also recognize in a more, let's say, in a wider international arena. Other anecdotes, he was nominal Archbishop of Theodosia, that is Feodosia, in Crimea. Right, the Catholic Church was present there, as this had been, as you know, one of the Genoese colonies in the Black Sea. It was not controlled by the Genoese anymore from centuries, but there was a significant Italian community there that would remain, in fact, up to pretty recent in time, and that was, in a Catholic sense, still ecumenically stretching, like the in what the papacy still realized is, of course, in a real world dominance and necessity for representation. Technically, this video is about Rome, or at least the history of Rome, and we'll not talk excessively about that for the city itself, but Benedict XIV's Rome is the Rome of the Trevi Fountain by Braccio. Here we don't even descend, in fact, in all the art, again, how do you see Rome? Do you conventionally see or think Rome like also in its 18th century dimension, right? We often think Rome as the Romans, the ancient Romans, then the Renaissance. But what about the rest? What about modern Rome? What about contemporary? What about medieval Rome? Do you realize how central and relevant this all was? Pope Lambertini was also the first ruler of the Papal States to create a sort of modern cartographical, say, not by him, he of course commissioned this to the experts, but of a modern cartographic representation of Rome. He provided to standardize the street signs for all the city, the actual street names and all. Like he made really a lot of different things today we'll not really see. He was also the first pontiff to institute the Via Crucis in Rome. Just Catholically speaking, that's not just a few. So this was more or less the man, and or just what you may find interesting in order to wanting to know more about him. In any case, let's get into the actually pretty dramatic international events of Benedict XIV's reign. The papacy of Pope Lambertini coincided with the onset of the War of the Austrian Succession. That, as you know, was an overwhelming deal, as the Habsburgic monarchy now fundamentally lacked a male heir, and since the house had basically monopolized the imperial title for centuries, and in this mid-18th century Europe, different powers were trying to sort of, autonomize themselves further from the previous order, almost a medieval one. That is the one you could see also from our series about the siege of Vienna, where still, again, the French mostly tended to invade Germany to try to work at the detriment of Austria. Like the Ottomans are rampantly aggressive, but Germany is fundamentally very dispersively fragmented. This is a very different world. This is a world, in fact, of nearly global power of the Europeans, of very intertwined alliances with all the major powers that have compacted them. Prussia now is affirming itself as a very consistent power. So it's a very different world from the one these people would have been habituated to. Consider just also a few days ago, at least, we made a video about the siege of Vienna again. Well, the young Lambertini was 13 when that occurred, so he could literally remember those years and the later ones, right? And so Louis XIV, Prince Eugene, I think of how this intertwined with Maria Theresia now. I want really to resume the series about Prince Eugene that I used to make years ago to restart it proper in a really much better and really updated way. But the papacy was very much a relevant power. You can argue as it's still today, except at the time they literally had a state encompassing large swaths of central and northern Italy, and as such, being a player among players. The War of the Austrian Succession, as you know, was pretty gruesome. It lasted for several years, and it had been sparked by the death of Emperor Charles VI in 1740, which in turn had led to the dispute over the throne, as his daughter Maria Theresia claimed the right to succession. However, her claim was immediately contested as she was a woman, and by fact through the traditional idea of imperial virile male succession by Charles Albert of Bavaria, that would also in fact be known as Holy Roman Emperor as Charles VII. This is a pose in fact in the Habsburgic series of imperial sovereigns. The guy had put forth his own candidacy, and the situation escalated when Frederick II of Prussia formed an alliance with the same Bavaria that, as you know, is a very Catholic state, one that at this point could not really sort of compete with the Habsburgic domains, but at large was very close to it, and now, especially by allying with Frederick the Great, could become a very dangerous pawn. This was a major issue concerning the initial papal backing to Charles, that in fact revealed itself to be a mistake. This all intertwines with the various Silesian wars, of course, because the Prussians, as you know, launched at this point an invasion of Silesia. Is a territory rich in mines. It's very strategic. The Prussians would always make this move, invade Saxony, then passing on to Silesia and trying essentially to strip it from the Habsburgs, which was, again, mostly to happen at the diplomatic table, but of course had to be prepared by this very brutal military means. As you know, we made lots of videos about the Prussian army of the era and the general strategic insight that Frederick really had as commander-in-chief, not just sovereign, but general and monarch at the same time, as a protagonist of the war. That was, in fact, brought into Habsburgic territory. Now, at large, of course, the relations between the papacy and the Habsburgic Empire had remained pretty solid. Here we are after the War of Austrian Succession, after which the Habsburgs had gotten Lombardy, that was essentially stripped from the Spanish that historically had controlled it since the Italian wars as an imperial territory, because it's part of the Italian Kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire. But as you know, with the War of Spanish Succession, the French, the Bourbon, basically had ascended to the Spanish throne. So those who had historically been the enemies of the Habsburgs now controlled through these, say, dominions, imperial territory, and represented especially also in southern Italy, like a very important, that was a vice kingdom, as you know, very autonomous, sort of big power, but subordinated to the general Spanish international posture, siding to profoundly unbalance. In fact, the international picture, the War of Spanish Succession, had been the biggest in terms of soldiers involved, like especially in single battles, mostly fought in the Flemish theater, but significant military engagements, to say the least, had occurred in Italy as well. There was this initial settlement whereby the Austrians aimed to southern Italy as well. The Savoy first gets Sicily, then they switch it with Sardinia. That will confer them, in fact, the Sardinian crown that was hierarchically more important within the Holy Roman Empire. So it's an interesting time, just per se. When you look at the Spanish posture during the War of the Austrian Succession, you realize that the Prussian-Bavarian alliance was supported by the Bourbon of Spain and France, right? And the objective of it was not merely, in fact, that the Silesian War was very much like a Central European theater, not really out of the reach, for example, as also the 7 Years' War would prove from, for example, French armies. We also have seen it in the video about Maurice the Saxe. But this, they, aside from the fact that there wasn't really too much need like to directly intervene there. In fact, the main objective of the Bourbon was to gain control of Lombardy, so stripping it from the Austrians and sort of controlling it through this Franco-Spanish alliance. So we're bringing also that previous Bourbon control on Milan. In fact, the ultimate purpose was to actually grant Lombardy to Philip of Bourbon, as well as France in practice. And meanwhile, Maria Theresia received limited support from England and Saxony. We were talking just the other day about the British strategy of the 7 Years' War, and we noticed how Britain basically strengthened considerably her Royal Navy after the subpar performance that she had during the War of Spanish Succession. Britain was not fully invested into this. Later on in the 7 Years' War, in fact, she would side with Prussia fully when France and Austria actually get allied. Saxony naturally was from the side of the Habsburgs because Prussia was her natural issue, despite being Protestant powers. But since the Treaty of Westphalia, as you know, that there wasn't much that Catholic Protestant contrast in sort of fixed axis blocks. This hadn't really been true even during the 30 Years' War itself with France, that basically creates the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus to intervene against the Catholic Habsburgs. And so the papacy was not just disappointed at such behavior from certain Catholic powers, but had to accept that in fact there would routinely be these wars among Catholics that, of course, since the Middle Ages weren't really rare, but now in a much neatly, in fact, 18th century-like outlined system of alliances that equally brought to an equal support here to power or another. Here I will not descend on why, for example, like the initial choice of Charles had happened, but the Holy See in this case was blackmailed by the Spanish that could simply pressure Rome from Naples, and in fact Lambertini backed the Wittelsbach in 1742 by legitimizing his election. Now, I would like to stress how important this is because, again, up to the previous century, what you get is basically something you could get in the Middle Ages as a broader international alignment. The papacy basically has normalized since the crisis of the later Middle Ages their relations with the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs, and the papacy back one another. There are other Catholic powers like Poland. That's all what our Vienna series, also from a diplomatic sort of international policy point of view, is about. All these machinations, but still with a solid Catholic fundamental, let's say. You have the French, again, infesting Germany, mostly this hegemonic power tending to harass the nominally universal but ever more regional Habsburgic power. Of course, lots of things have happened now. Austria is actually a much bigger power than before, especially after the triumph of Vienna and the various campaigns. Following that, the triumphs of Prince Eugene, that in part had been thwarted by the short-sightedness of the same Charles VI that had not really given Prince Eugene, contrary to the very untimely lost Emperor Joseph I, that was likely to be the greatest Habsburgic monarch, again, hadn't he passed away so early, in order to press on against the Turks, etc. So lots of things have changed. Now, paradoxically, like, the picture is more complicated, at least in the sense that states are more stable and they're more concentrated. This is the age of the so-called absolute monarchies that witness a great deal, again, of statal development, in fact, also military efficientation, so to say. But there are so many more different, bigger powers that combine these alliances, as we've just seen, in different ways. Now, this brought, of course, an issue because the War of Austrian succession was to be fought on Italy as well. Right. Normally, during the 18th century, you know that Germany and Italy were known as the so-called weak regions of Europe because they were politically fragmented. They lacked any major sort of hegemonic power, regardless of strong realities. Like, I mean, at least if we look at Austria and Prussia, they're geographically more outside of Germany than inside. In Italy, you had also Naples, that was a major power. But at large, it was easy to enter Flanders or certain German states or the Po Valley, right? And the, say, 18th century warfare, we'll talk more about this from a strictly strategical point of view, was ever more projecting, was allowing for a much greater maneuver, right, on the map of Europe than it had ever been the case before. Still relatively primitive times, we're stressing it in that video about the 7-Year War, and I made even another one, as you know, about the intrinsic limits of the armies of the 7 Years' War. In this sense, never underestimate the areas. Like if you look at Western, Southern Europe, you realize that actually these countries are more developed than Central Europe, right? The Prussian army that correctly passes for this steamroller and the top-notch disciplinary example, etc., was also, if you look at Prussia per se, it was not an infinite country. Pretty modest, in fact, in its autonomy. I've seen it just in terms of command control and the limits that Frederick recognized, and things were done very empirically in many ways. When you look at countries like Italy or France, etc., you realize that these places are still very well infrastructurally served. Like the notion, again, of the decline of this war. I mean, how many people talk about the Neapolitan army in the 18th century? Barely no one. It's all about, again, mostly the obvious, say, interest and in, especially from that mostly Anglo-American Protestant bias towards the rising stars. Britain, Prussia, no doubt, we all know where they went during the 18th, the 19th century, but let's say never lose sight of the rest, because these powers could have not also done the things they were doing hadn't there been a European system of powers that was actually pretty bulky and sizable. Now, what was happening in Italy that was, as we've seen, like the object of contention, also as far as Lombardy, by far the most advanced part of the peninsula. In fact, the most important land within the Habsburgic Empire, like Lombardy, was more advanced than Austria, in that the French wanted to take for themselves. Remember, the French have always done this, right? If you look at the various attempts of, like, from Charlemagne to Francis I to Louis XIV and later Napoleon, it's always the same story, right? France considers Italy, in a broader sense, as simply an extension of French dominion at large, and that's the beautifully imperial mindset of the French. We'll also come to discuss back soon for their 18th century military. That was really something. So again, in Italy, the initial opposition of Charles Emmanuel III of Savoy, Sardinia, to Austria shifted when he realized that Spanish and Neapolitan forces were planning to invade Lombardy, right, on behalf of France. In fact, Savoy already at this time in history, of course, sought to control Lombardy themselves, right? To a degree, there had been an Habsburgic Savoyard cooperation, also and especially against the French. Think about the siege of Turin, led by Prince Eugene, that was actually to inform the same Prussian military with all the, in fact, Hohenzollern advisors that took part of that, and that brought even Frederick II, as you know, to develop his army in the wake of this great model that Prince Eugene had been. We'll come back on this thing, because also this chain is so crucial. If you don't understand that, for example, like what do you really know about 18th century warfare? Nobody really knows, right? However, Savoy had, if anything, as you know, always been in this precarious balance, so much so that there are the usual jokes eventually extended later to unitary Italy that they shifted side at Semilia. And because, of course, Savoy was, as you know, it was a heavily militaristic state, a bit like Prussia in the sense that they were both countries that risked to be wiped off the map because of the much bigger neighbors that they had. So this prompted, through the Metus Hostilis, the necessity of this military pursuit. In fact, fundamentally, if you look at it, as Prussia would unify Germany later, Savoy would unify Italy later, and there are very strong and interesting parallelisms, including the ones I just made between Prince Eugene and Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau. Savoy was enrocked on the Alps. They had actually established, like they were essentially a French power that, however, had shifted its center into the Papal, like Piedmont, fundamentally Turin. Unavoidable, like this was, of course, a much better region than most of southeastern France to begin with, where they could have simply not expanded. As we said before, Italy, considered one of the weak areas of Europe, offered this opportunity. There are sort of several states in northern Italy that are, in fact, in this area where different spheres of influence from bigger powers overlap. And Savoy is habituated now to simply gamble, and with the ultimate objective, however, of seizing majorly developed areas like Milan, and therefore, like, consolidating actually a hell of a power had it been allowed, right, in the Papal. Also essentially controlling Genoa and having this, as it would happen later, famous industrial triangle. This, during the 19th century, was actually one of the single most intensively industrialized areas in Europe. Italy didn't really have much more than that in those terms, but there are a bit these centers that remained in that development still to this day, from also quite a while. The Middle Ages, we talk about Milanese armored, Milanese military industry since, in fact, quite like the 12th century, right? So it's all considered these military cultures, because they're always almost frowned upon, mostly because I think like the cliches about World War II and so on. But when you look at a compact, say, understanding of European military culture, you can't avoid bypassing these chapters. Similar to other Italian states, the Holy See acknowledged Maria Theresa's hereditary rights as established by the Pragmatic Sanction of 1730. The papacy, as we've seen, is pressured by the Spanish to initially side with Charles. What would become Charles had already been elected as Charles VII of the Holy Roman Empire. So initially, the Pope had even proclaimed neutrality in an attempt to prevent foreign troops from passing through papal territory, and later expressed a willingness to support the imperial throne candidate who would be most beneficial to the Church. That's how eventually the Spanish sort of had the papacy recognizing that imperial election against the Habsburgic interests. But the Austrians knew that this was not really because the papacy had much of a choice in that context, and they were aware, of course, of the fact there was no real ideological hatred at all. Nevertheless, it was a pretty serious business, because if the Spanish, the French could coerce the papacy into this sort of subservience, they could use it as a pawn against Austria further, while she was fighting against Prussia. So actually a pretty dire situation, because major allies were really far and not really capable of intervening so directly in Central Europe. So it was just a tete-a-tete between the Austrians and the Prussians. And the Italian theater was, in a sense, to be left not on its own, as we will see now, but still was yet another enormous source of strain also for Austrian finances and so on. So by 1743, in spite of all these machinations, especially from our papal perspective now, like, trying, the priority was to keep armies out of Italy and consequently also the Papal States, the war would actually spread to Italian soil. In the autumn of that year, despite the Pope's protests, the warring parties established their winter camps within Papal territory itself, with Austrian forces near Bologna, and being essentially supported by the papacy, because now the Austrian big guns had arrived, and so now the Spanish were a bit in trouble. And in fact, their forces had, at this point, they held sway. They had arrived through Tuscany, and they were near Pesaro and Rimini on the Adriatic watershed of the Apennines, having crossed these. Tuscany was another power here, but in fact not particularly, active, or one that can at least compete with major powers in Europe. The following spring, an Austrian army of 26,000 soldiers, which is a lot, right? I made the other day an entire video about the North American theater. We highlighted even in there how those were sort of very scarce forces altogether for an entire continental context, compared to these provincial ones that the Europeans, of course, would quite seriously take care of, with, in fact, tens of thousands of men. In this case, the Austrian army was led by General Lobkowitz, and they reached Monterotondo, close to Rome. This is essentially almost, I think Monterotondo is a town on its own, but it's just so much on the outskirts of Rome. There are some interesting military events happening in different, say, minor ones, but throughout the centuries. And the Pope reaches Lobkowitz exactly here, the Austrian camp north of Rome, before positioning the Austrians in the Roman castles, so reaching Rome, like passing to the southeast of the city. And in fact, in these historical places, those are the Lake of Albano, the Alba Longa historically was. So these are heights, volcanic heights, that are pretty good for taking position and essentially shielding Rome from the Neapolitan side. This really controlled the access routes from Naples, and so placed also the Spanish in sort of a difficult situation. In fact, Charles of Bourbon established himself with 24,000 men at Velletri, that is further south of Rome. These, as you understand, are very balanced forces, 26 versus 24,000, right? The situation in Rome became thus increasingly precarious, as the devastation, first of all, in Romagna and the Marche, so in northern central Italy from the Adriatic side of the Apennine watershed within the Papal States, disrupted revenue and supply inflows to the capital, right? Imagine you have, like, this is also what banally video games will show you, like if you have enemies, right? Think about Empire Total War. If you have guys raiding those places, devastating, and you have less revenue, you need at least to retake control. And while armies are there, like, it's very difficult to do so because they're going to exact supplies, contributions. In fact, the situation was especially as further exacerbated by the plundering in the same Lazio region, which left Rome without provisions, as this was the Roman countryside and hinterland. You have over 50,000 soldiers. Those really cost a lot in terms of supplies, logistically, and it's mostly they're not completely living off the land, but of course somebody has to supply them, and the Papal States also does with the Austrians. The Austrians that in August capture Velletri, so actually succeeding in temporarily dislodging the Bourbon. In fact, they nearly managed to take Charles captive, but the Neapolitans in turn managed to drive the Austrians back from the same Velletri. This is a hotly contested clash. Actually, the two armies are refusing to engage into like a major pitched battle. In fact, they resumed their previous positions, confronting each other until autumn, which was also the moment in which armies could not really operate anymore. They were risking a lot, right? As we've seen, these armies were extremely costly. Yes, they could move from region to region in Europe, but if they were adequately supplied, and in any case they cost so much that even risking a major engagement was a matter of desperation. This happens especially in the Silesian theater, because the Prussians are mostly running against time, when especially the enemies manage to coalesce and put them under adequate pressure that alone Prussia could not withstand. So the Prussians would seek for an engagement, a resultative engagement, as quickly as possible. Here it's a different situation. With the bad season in October, Lobkowitz was ordered to withdraw and assist the King of Sardinia, who was on the verge of being overwhelmed by French and Spanish forces. Savoy was from the Habsburgic side in this war, and they were, of course, facing a lot of pressure in northern Italy. On November the 10th, the Austrians left the Roman castles, passing beneath the walls of Rome herself. Just imagine these pictures. Again, you will not find a mini-series or whatever like taking place in these contexts, but they happen. Like, I think the beauty of having a YouTube channel like talking history in this way is, in fact, telling people, look, this was a thing, right? This was a moment in which these people fought and died and worked and feared and worried and, had all these concerns, and it happened just alongside, say, the Roman walls, what you can still visit to then realizing it's not just about, say, antiquity, it's about a lot of centuries of European history passing by. The Austrians, in fact, crossed the Tiber at such a famous military location in the past as the Milvian Bridge, right? And also, however, on a bridge of boats, because naturally these were a bit more complex armies to handle, and they required some more modern sort of engineering capacity to facilitate at least a quick crossing. Don't think that they were incredibly more efficient means than ones of thousands of years before. However, consider artillery, consider like a wholly different picture that is also augmenting, as you know, towards the end of the century in a ever qualitative sense, like more firepower, more combined arms, and this costs really a lot. In all this, the Neapolitans pursued the Austrians, camping between the Milvian Bridge and Porta Pia. This is incredibly fascinating. Again, imagine the places and just know that the Neapolitan army was there. The Neapolitans did intervene a lot actually in all these wars in the 18th century up to northern Italy. And on November the 3rd, King Charles of Naples entered Rome with his entourage. He was at that point warmly welcomed by the Roman populace as a victor, because the idea is that the Austrians are withdrawing fundamentally. The Neapolitans have won, right? And as you know, the Neapolitan-Papal relations at large had historically been warm since, at least not always, because I was thinking since Norman times where in fact the Normans declared themselves vassals of the papacy, so that technically the Kingdom of Sicily was a papal fief. The Normans also sacked Rome during these apparently peacekeeping and actually guarding operations that happened between the clashes during the clashes between Henry IV and, in fact, the Hauteville. Nevertheless, in this sense, the papacy, as you understood, was de facto passive power. It was mostly like the Austrians doing all the work. Now the Neapolitans arrived, that were also a hell of a power, and the papacy has to be gallant, and he receives Charles of Bourbon in the cafe house of the Quirinal Gardens that is still there, and this brings also the Pope to accompany Charles of Bourbon to visit St. Peter's Basilica and the Lateran one. Remember that technically the papacy had already been intimidated by the Neapolitans, as we've seen, supporting Charles VII. And as we'll see now, things will change because eventually the Habsburgs come back to the imperial throne. Here, again, there is this friendly encounter between the two heads of state. By the way, the King of Naples was based in Velletri, which, as we've seen, the army had the Napoleon army had tested, and in fact, he would return the same evening with his coach there, right, from Rome, after the visit of Rome and the Pope. And in this sense, the papacy wasn't faring well, right? The misfortunes of the ecclesiastical state persisted as the Austrian army quartered in Bologna during winter, so prolonging the hostilities within the papal territory. The Neapolitans contributed to that as they pursued with their army the Austrians as far as Perugia in the Apenninic heartland, but they eventually came back, and in this other bad season, we are a year after, in 1744, they encamped in Viterbo to spend winter, which meant that for years, the Papal States experienced the continuation of damage, requisitions, and looting, with both belligerents demanding significant contributions, including money, from the papacy. Then, in fact, at different times pays both. This makes you understand how serious the situation was. As I was saying before, just imagine this having happened at another time. You really understand the step further, like in historical change, considering how the papacy is treated and how much they can't basically oppose much power on their own to these other players they're dependent on. The year 1745 changes things because Charles VII of Bavaria dies. So at this point, there is another imperial election that brings Francis I of Lorraine, that is, as you know, Maria Theresa's husband, to the throne. That's how the imperial house of Habsburg-Lorraine arrived. In fact, the reason how the war would conclude, in part, was the fact that Maria Theresa's husband was more acceptable as a man for the Habsburgic continuation of power, especially now that sort of the various contendants had sort of exhausted themselves for other reasons that here we don't have time to see, because mostly we're focusing on the papacy. Telling the truth, the war continued intensely in Piedmont, Lombardy, and Liguria, only concluding in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. This treaty saw significant concessions from all parties involved, confirming the imperial title Francis I, whom the Pope had already implicitly recognized. So now the Habsburgs and the papacy are fully aligned, back to the older alliance. Frederick II of Prussia retained control of Silesia, which had also been the majorly bitter bite that the Habsburgs had to swallow in order to bring an end to the war, while Philip of Bourbon was granted the Duchy of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla in northern Italy, disregarding papal feudal rights once again. This is not Philip V of Bourbon of Spain, because he had died 2 years before. This is his son, in fact, the namesake Philip of Bourbon, that becomes, in fact, the Duke of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla, while Spain now was ruled by the elder brother, the son of Philip V, Ferdinand VI. Right? We will talk at some point how these territories had become part of the Papal States, because it's all really fascinating. You know that these territories had been gradually subsumed by the papacy from the later Middle Ages into the Renaissance and beyond, mostly as in the shrinking, in fact, of Holy Roman Imperial authority around. Now it's different. Now these are just essentially pawns, very important ones, because these duchies, by the way, were very strategic, right? Piacenza, Parma, but these are Guastalla. These were very important strategic territories since the times of the Matildic legacy, right? And in the 11th and the 12th century, and that in fact the empire and papacy had been battling over. Well, this is interesting from a medieval historical perspective, because you realize that this strongholds remained still in the age of Enlightenment, just as they had historically been, that strategically relevant in the European balance of power. Again, most people do not even care about such things, like even during the 30 Years' War, the War of Mantuan Succession. I should make a video about that. These tiny Italian states were to be actually the tip of the balance during these, if not all European, but mostly all of European clashes. It's also not irrelevant that the papacy had been controlling them. Through careful diplomacy and strategic concessions, Benedict XIV managed essentially to contain the challenges posed by absolutism and rationalism in all this. It was a struggle. You see, these wars, these clashes were sort of underscoring a change in historical mindset in general. The fact that, again, that the Papal States as a broader authority could be bypassed, right, also in the international stage, just for their own more concretely, material, say, earthly power-driven and increasingly modern and secularized worldviews and, wills to power, right? This questioned the church's independence and temporal power as well, meaning, like, what should there be a papal state to begin with? And these were not just, these were not fanatic Protestants that had arrived at the gates of Rome and sort of destroyed everything. These were actually some of the most historically Catholic powers ever, like Spain, Naples, France, right? So, well, okay, for France we know that, they allied even with the Turks, and that was always a bit the exception. But in general, like, even just the way, you see here, it's not the word, despising one another. All the rulers that we discussed before were actually very traditional, were very, in a sense, aware of the aristocratic role. And in fact, absolutism is wrongly called like this because these states, government and administration were trying, of course, to concentrate power, but they were doing it from, say, an institutional standpoint that recognized the divine sanction of rulers to command, to defend and serve their subjects. If these people had known what would have happened in 50 years with the French Revolution and later on properly with the nation state, they would have been horrified. It would have been completely shocked, and they would have probably recognized that they had contributed to this kind of tendencies. It was also increasingly difficult, of course, to control a world with these political and institutional systems like before, because of course you must understand that if the ancien regime eventually failed, it is, of course, also just by plain tradition, the leader's fault primarily, right? Before anyone else, because they hadn't managed to win over their own, say, the people through their own historical imperial Catholic prerogatives, and so the world again we still live in seems more like a sort of provisional government based on, again, the notion that there is a state that exists almost for the sake of itself and that doesn't seem to trace any origin back to the sacred, back to God, right? This is completely inconceivable. Instead, still in these generations, all these rulers were fervent, like in this case, Catholic leaders, and also, as we've seen it with Frederick the Great and others, like even of course from the Protestant side, and all the traditional crumbling that had occurred for these to even exist. Of course, it was an incredibly ancestral and traditional way of reasoning in power applications, in models, in ideas. In fact, most of these, of the sort of the more enlightened, if you talk about Maria Theresa, the Saint Frederick, these weren't actually particularly liberal, say, rulers at all. Right? Joseph II was considered to be excessive in that regard. We will talk about these figures because there was some sort of almost self-sabotage creeping in. It's not like I in the Kaputziner Kirche, I broke down in tears in front of the tomb of Maria Theresa and Joseph II, besides all the people that were there, looking at me. But so I estimate the guy, because in fact the same presuppositions were true. It's not like Joseph II was a hippie libertine, or the libertines were also a very different thing. Actually, it's a misnomer for what we actually think, at least conventionally use the term like. But of course, again, that cracking was starting to emerge, right? The Saint Benedict XIV, for example, at the beginning, I presented him to you as if he was just, I don't know, liberal person. But he really wasn't. Like, there were some things, for example, for which he was incredibly reactionary. For example, he had a great, he brought the Jews under stricter regulation and contributed fueling those superstitions against them. That was, for example, an aspect for all the culture and sort of innovative thinking that this Pope displayed. Also in that direction of opening towards those apparently less traditional ideas that, was strongly reinforced. And that wasn't even specifically being particularly harsh with the Jews, actually the traditional point of the same Catholic Church that had historically always defended them, together with the secular establishment, for that matter. It's just lesser people that always indulge in that kind of trying to steal the Jews' wealth for themselves in the same ways. But in any case, we will talk about this in another circumstance. The contexts, of course, are very complex here. If we were to digress on the actual reforms of the Church or of the Papal States that were enacted by Benedict XIV, we will have, in fact, to make another video. And that's what I'm going to do at some point. In any case, when you look at the international scene, diplomatic relations, normal, in fact, ones were reestablished with Charles Emmanuel III of Sardinia through the Concordat of 1741. So during the war, as you understand, when these powers were allied, and with the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies as well, although subsequent tensions arose with that. The Pope also reached agreements with John V of Portugal in 1750 and with Spain in 1753. So again, we're in different times, but there is a realignment, a forging of, say, this normal relations after the war. Again, Benedict had been chosen by the various groups exactly during the conclave exactly because he was not either just pro one side or another. He wanted to get along with everyone, right? After protracted negotiations, a compromise was reached, even with Frederick II of Prussia, in fact, implying, say, implicitly recognizing at least him as a royal title holder, as we were saying before, with a very specific Catholic meaning. This wasn't done just out of mere say, recognition of Protestant power per se, which shows you here also how the meanings are deeply traditional to an extent, but because the Hohenzollern there was seen, remember the traditional view of the sovereign, what he has to do, as a protector of the Catholic subjects in Silesia that had been acquired by the Prussians. This is important because, again, this is not like a uniform nation state. People think that in history people reason like that. If, a nobleman of this kind would have looked at what we have become to, even their own country, they would spit in the face of lesser people that today cosplay as if they were Frederick II, or he cared about, lesser people from which they, the background of which these people were commonly come from. So it's so weirdly funny how sort of nationalism as a deeply anti-traditional ideology, a fourth estate and anti-insane regime ideology, pretends to use traditional rulers, right, as, some people they can wink at. They would have spit in your face again, and they would have done really well. So the notion is, of course, that this is a ruler. There is a heavily chosen ruler that has to rule over different peoples. And interestingly enough, of course, the papacy, because this is what Catholic power, as we explained many times from a theological point of view, is about. Like Frederick II was recognized to the extent of his imperium on Silesia, that had a large Catholic population, that as such recognized the ruler, even though he was a Protestant. Again, Frederick, like many so-called absolutistic ruler of the age of enlightenment, wasn't a liberal ruler at all. Nor the papacy was, but they had to recognize at least that now a Protestant ruled over such a substantial Catholic population. Also, if anything, to protect them further in an international scene. Many of these people would have liked to come back under the Habsburgs, for example, and so you couldn't just pretend that just you had to disconfess either them or the Hohenzollern by not, otherwise alienating even large swaths of Catholic population in that province. In the meanwhile, there were disputes with France, that, as you know, a very Catholic country. However, with certain internal doctrinal, theological issues, and at large, policy of power, well expressed by Gallicanism, that, as we've seen, had brought also to the invasion of Italy, to the general disregard, of course, of papal matters at large. And so France was always the tendentially hegemonic terrestrial power of the era. Since Louis the XIV, you couldn't simply tell them what to do. And there is a long history of that issues. It's Philip IV and Boniface VIII. Disputes with France were, however, and between France and Benedict XIV were largely confined to religious matters for this reason. They couldn't even dictate them politically what to do. This generated significant tensions, though, due to the conflicts between Orthodox Catholics, supported by the weak Louis XV at that point, at least in the government, and the Jansenists. We'll talk about this chapter in Louis XV's reign. The Jansenists, as you know, were tendentially, this is where more like the Armenians from the other side of the Protestants, like more leaning toward the Catholics. They had some aspects of Protestantism, like at least they conferred a much greater importance to faith, to a liminal degree that seems like sola fide, right? And so partly diminishing the importance of the works. As you know, the Huguenots had been expelled from France for good in the previous century, but it's not like you could simply dictate such a large demographic pool simply what to think about religious matters, especially in such a tormented time in history. And with other Protestant powers, of course, like contrasting the local monarchy, because that's what happens. I mean, look at how today, propaganda is done across, countries, etc. Like, imagine at the time the same identical thing existing. So if you're fighting against a Protestant country as a Catholic one, you're going to have Protestants sort of spreading theological ideas that will resemble more in fact, Protestantism, so as covert Protestants, etc. Like, it's always the same thing. Like, if you look at the map and see just blocks with, say, neatly separated confessional orientations, even after the age of Reformation and Counter-Reformation, that's not really how it was. In fact, Louis XV was facing pretty severe issues, as the Jansenists had the backing of the Parliament, and France was really a very difficult country to rule on. It's not like the French Revolution was the first time, there had been a major uprising in France. This routinely happened. It happened lots of times under Louis XIV. It happened also under Louis XV. And so this disillusioned populace that was feeling all the burden of this massive French power policy that had to keep together like this enormous country plus the colonies, etc., was becoming really... The revolution is not that far away, right? We've seen it with the 7 Years' War. There is the big defeat for France, losing her major colony. Then, you have the French supporting the rising Americans and indebting themselves so much that eventually, with a bit of agricultural harvest shortcomings and general political, erosion of constituted order, you would have something like the French Revolution. These were delicate issues because the papacy really embodied that Catholic, Orthodox approach that should have sort of been religiously followed by all the major allies, at least the Catholic ones. And of course, such deep struggles within such a big country like France, that was in part even antagonizing with the papacy in a strictly secular point. I mean, in terms of, again, this, as we've seen, there was a war in which essentially the papacy was from the fighting, supporting the Austrians from the other side, made things sort of much more controversial. Naturally, Benedict XIV was very happy when France and Austria allied themselves. Regarding the Unigenitus Bull, the Pope cautiously expressed his views through a brief in a circular, but the issue remained unresolved. essentially the Unigenitus was this apostolic constitution in the form of a papal bull promulgated by Clement XI in 1713 that opened the final phase of the Jansenist controversy in France, as it essentially censored like the literally 101 propositions by Pasquier Quesnel that had been, in fact, was a major Jansenist theologian, and the initial belief, like these were again very similar ideas. The issues had started from the usual commentary to the Gospels. Cornelius Jansenius, this was a Dutch bishop of Jever in Flanders, and he had opened these issues at the time, say, of the 30 Years' War, and ever since there had been this periodical infiltrations. We've seen also in the video about some different French generals, even not just from in the video about the French Wars of Religion, how much the Huguenots had been informed by this connection with the Netherlands, and how many also crypto Protestants existed within some, say, behind some, in fact, underneath, say, some Catholic appearance of sorts. So again, delicate topics, but this is not fully what we are discussing here. In any case, the matter wasn't simply solved at the time of Benedict XIV either. Following the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, relations between the Holy See and Austria were restored. As we have seen, every misunderstanding was now forgotten, and issues concerning the county of Carpegna, by the way, in the Patriarchate of Aquileia. These were also other old questions that we skip. We just say that the Patriarchate of Aquileia was one of the most important, as you know, ecclesiastical principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, was abolished at this point with the institution of the Archbishopric of Udine within the territory of the Venetian Republic and of Gorizia in Austrian territory. This is, if anything, for a medievalist, an epoch-making change, but of course the decline of the Patriarchate was a very old thing, but this had historically been such a great ecclesiastical principality again. As you can imagine it from a broader papal perspective, after the War of Austrian Succession that had been fought within the same papal states with great devastations, as we have recorded, Benedict XIV was particularly pleased with the rapprochement between Austria and France, the two great Catholic powers that had been in conflict for centuries. This is also a major change, as we were saying at the beginning, imaging finally the Capetians and the Habsburgs making peace. The Bourbons are Capetians themselves, and in imaging, in this sense, Italy being shrouded about now this Catholic power crown, right, where Spain, France, Austria, so all the major neighbors of the Papal States, or at least of Italy, are partly also the Papal States, are now acting as one. Again, also Naples. So this is a majorly positive change for the papacy. However, the Treaty of Versailles in 1756, which formalized the agreement between the two states, preceded. A military alliance was put into action against Prussia. So France and Austria found themselves fighting against not just Prussia, but also Britain, that at that point was freaking out for essentially the alignment of Austria, France, and Spain. The English essentially hoped that Prussia could hold out on the continent and harass France. And as we've seen during the War of Austrian Succession, they had actually sided with Austria. because they thought France would become too powerful by succeeding in Italy and potentially also like giving a tough time to the Austrians directly into Central Europe. Now, the axis changed, and as a consequence, Britain sided with Prussia against Austria. This meant that the Mediterranean, as we've seen the other day with the episode of Minorca in 1757, was also now a war theater, but for the Papal States was at large like a terrestrial power that didn't have many, I don't know, important naval bases, whatever. It was actually to be left alone by these major confrontations, right? So this would actually open to a moment of peace. It's just a great historical change. France and Austria accepting to share power in the heart of the continent, while mostly contrasting now a Protestant alliance that has this sort of new ways of proceeding. As we were saying before, Britain essentially taking off as a global naval power, and Prussia becoming sort of strongest, say more qualitatively powerful country on the continent, like not the greatest power, not the more threatening for the entire order, but still this wedge that you simply can't erase like before from the map, right? Consider that, as you know, in a couple of decades it would be the partition of Poland, Lithuania, that had de facto become a Muscovite vassal, and so these powers would in part like increase further, and so that's how, especially the very composite way, Prussia came to be made of. This led, in fact, to the 7 Years' War that involved also other European states, as we know. And despite his prolonged illness, the Pope had different issues. He suffered of gout, etc. Benedict XIV closely followed the course of military events. They were also breathtaking because Prussia again was about to be wiped out on 3 distinct occasions, and it did not happen. As you know, the Hohenzollern called for miracle there, which was also like a provocation against their opponents, the Catholic ones. Of course, they were fighting also against the Russians, but in general. And in 1757, the Pope insisted on being carried to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore for a Thanksgiving service after the defeat of the Prussians at the Battle of Kolin. That, as you know, was one of the greatest defeats of Frederick II. Until the end of his life, Benedict fulfilled his duties as much as his condition allowed, and passed away on May the 3rd, 1758, after a rapid collapse. He was 83, which was, quite a feat for the time. Now imagine this world, really. Imagine what it could be, and where again these people had come from. The guy had been born in 1675. 1756, like when the Pope died, like Mozart was only 2 years old, right? In fact, 2 years later he would perform in the same Rome, the same Pope. So it wasn't just a part of the old world going by, but also a part of, at that point, the newer world that for us is an old world, right? Mozart, for example, was very patriotic, apparently, was profoundly Catholic. He, of course, despised any sort of liberal, aside from certain, of course, innovation in his musical themes, and I mean operas, plays, etc. Like the concept is that he was profoundly pro, of course, the broader Habsburgic purpose. He was profoundly horrified by the French Revolution. He did not live long enough, fortunately, just as Maria Theresa, to see Marie Antoinette beheaded. But in this sense, just think about how sort of more traditional, more ancien regime Mozart that we feel relatively close is, just even compared to Beethoven, that is more like the Napoleonic era, right? And so just think how, like, the watershed, right? What it meant for a pope, for a person with a distinct ecclesiastical career, just in ancient regime, to become the Bishop of Rome, to have been born in 1675, as I was saying before, like, well, sort of aware of events like, I don't know, the Christian victory at Vienna over the Ottomans. It's just that close of a world, right? When you trace back your ancestry, if you're lucky enough to have the name of your ancestry, like, for example, from my father's side, the patrilineal line, we arrived to know about, like, the late 17th century. It's basically the same, more or less the same age of, Benedict XIV, when you look at the date of birth and death. So it's really mind-blowing when you think about it, and it's also that close, but also, say, that close in time. This is what is important, in my opinion, to maintain, but also so distant in spirit, in culture, in beliefs. That, to me, is actually, it's about like our lack of belief. It's not even the active distance in our belief, in the sense that we have substituted it with something else. No, we have simply lost, right? And that's the thing that sort of makes you think the most about these chapters. The fact that we really lost what for these people was so readily evident, which, again, it's as I was saying at the beginning of the video, seems to be now a ghost, right? Completely lost, forgotten, in the, not even in the midst of history, of some reminiscence, but again, completely removed. In fact, it may seem so strange, but remember all those things that were written on my ideology, regardless of, say, nobody ever commented on my historical content. Nobody ever said, oh no, this guy says this that is not correct, because they're zero. There's just, oh, this guy is talking ideological stuff. How? Exactly. Like, pick a video like this. I know that if I say things like this, I'm automatically like a guy that's making ideology and not history. I'm actually telling you the history of, and I'm actually telling you that, look, there isn't many other ways to see this. Like, it's not like what I said here made up, or the way they saw the world is made up. Just read the stuff that was issued encyclically by Benedict XIV. What kind of expressions they had. You can disagree, you can have other ideas, but the mere notion that at the time, like, that we can we can tell history through a filter that, let's say, as if the general temper of the time was essentially what we want them to believe, because we impose it on them from our standpoint, while they literally believed completely different things, and we are extensively documented about it, is what you've actually been tricked by. This is the real issue. This is the thing that you've been fooled with. Like, if you really want to believe in a conspiracy theory of some sort, you don't necessarily even have to do with this, because otherwise most conspiracy theories are stupid, not because, like, certain things do not happen. It's just that people somehow think that somebody's hiding them from you, or that, because they follow the narrative of some other chicken brain people that are somehow have still a greater cerebral capacity than them, and they have to feel important because they sort of find out what also was sort of normal common knowledge, at point aside from certain conspiracies that are not conspiracies, they're just, I don't know, I want to believe whatever I want without any burden of evidence or whatever. Like, at that point, it's just whatever you want. It's more like a mental disturbance than anything. But with history, actually, it's that easy to just look at this stuff and realize how consistently traditional this world was. And if anything, like tracing the entire, say, crumbling of this, but also acknowledging, in fact, what we lost in why we have specifically been funneled, as I was saying before, in a way or another, consciously or unconsciously, and partly even subconsciously, because that happens as a form of self-sabotage that is inherent, a very specific psychological condition that fits with the current times, the depletion of individual worth, etc., that feels hatred towards himself, that in fact must be portrayed in the sense of, if anybody, say not anybody, but specifically me, because I am documenting this, also in many videos, like this guy's saying something we've never heard. Well, it's not my fault if you feel threatened by elementary historical notions that you don't. Again, I'm not writing this history. I'm not getting this information from ideological texts. I'm not getting, it's just the basics. If you read a biography about Benedict XIV, or if you read just, it can be even a Wikipedia article for that matter. I don't do that, but say there you would find plenty of information, plenty of reference. Let's actually do it. I'm not sure whether the English Wikipedia has this Benedict XIV. I mean, you can immediately see here, well, it's a pretty sizable article, actually. For example, this here, see also. The Apostolice Servitius, the papal bull issued by Pope Benedict XIV, 1741. And why don't you read that? This is a click away through under the sun English Wikipedia, the text of a bull that you can't find on the internet. Read that and understand what this is really about. Read the corresponding, say, I don't know, the Habsburgic papal relations during this time. It's plenty of diplomatic studies on this stuff. Read what they wrote, what they exchanged. If you don't believe that this is what this was all about, right? And so the entire notion of the 18th century about the steam engine and science booming and, all the world changing like the way we are now. Guys, this is history, right? This is not a sort of fantasy designed for entertaining the mentally feeble. This is hardcore reality. If you're not willing to accept that, and if you want to legitimately go beyond reality also in the spiritual avenue, read what tradition described the world like and why, and realize what this gets down to at the end of the day. It's the only way, right? I wouldn't, again, we'll talk again about Benedict the 14th, also to see better like the papal government in the papal states in Rome and so on. But be aware that, say, when, for example, you visit Rome, you pass by the Trevi Fountain made at the time, that was the world. Do you know what's the symbology of the Trevi Fountain? Just for the record, just for the record. These are rhetorical questions. Investigate them, try to give it an answer. This is what I'm doing on YouTube. Right? For all people who feel somehow threatened by this, just know that that's exactly what you should feel until you get it. And this is it. For the rest, you've seen here also the pictures I used. So there is plenty of beautiful. Here, what's this? Paulanese Rome Capitol procession. This is a beautiful picture that passed by before, right? With the musketeers, with this is like the same place that you can visit in Rome today, with the Araceli, the Conservatory Palace, etc. Like, imagine how it could be in the 18th century. Imagine how Rome could be in the 18th century. This is important. It's not trivial. And of course, like, here we are not even fully entering in the deep ecclesiological issues and beyond. We're just presenting what could be a sketch. This the stuff you could learn in a simple, like, with a university course or whatever. Like, be really curious. I mean, just realize that somebody has already written a lot of stuff. It's not about being curious, meaning do whatever you want, right? You can't do whatever you want, unfortunately, for you, right? But that's also for what fully you deserve. But it's exactly because you can't follow a discipline that you can enhance your liberty, right? And gradually freeing yourself in attaining power. This is what Catholicism is about. For the rest, it's always just a pleasure to talk about Roman history, about this century that we have just began recently to get a bit more in depth, the 18th. For today, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.